It all started so suddenly that I didn't even see it coming. Ethan and I had been married for 17 years. We built a life together, raised 2 kids, bought a home, and promised we'd grow old side by side. I thought we were unshakable. But one day, something in him changed. He stopped looking at me the same way. Our dinner conversations turned into awkward silence. He started staying late at work, saying he had projects that couldn't wait. At first, I believed him. I thought maybe he was just tired or stressed. He'd always been a hard worker, and I tried to be understanding. But the late nights turned into weekends away, and the excuses never made sense anymore. I began to notice the smallest details, the faint smell of perfume that wasn't mine on his shirts, the way he'd smile at his phone and quickly put it away when I walked into the room. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe I was imagining things. But deep down I knew. One evening, he came home with his shirt untucked, hair messy, and that perfume clinging to him again. When I asked, he snapped at me for being paranoid. That was when I stopped asking questions and started looking for answers. I remember sitting in the dark one night, scrolling through his phone after he'd fallen asleep. My hands trembled as I opened his messages. There she was, Brooke Miller. The way he texted her wasn't how a married man spoke to another woman. They were flirting, planning dinners, laughing about inside jokes. She was 25, a fitness instructor, with long blonde hair and a perfect smile. I felt sick. When I confronted him the next morning, he didn't even deny it. He just stared at me like he was waiting for me to explode. And when I finally asked why, he said, "She makes me feel alive again." Those words crushed me more than the betrayal itself. 17 years of love and loyalty, thrown away for a moment of excitement with someone half his age. I packed a small bag that day and left. I couldn't look at him without feeling like a fool. The humiliation hit me hardest when people started whispering. Everyone knew. Our friends, his coworkers, even the neighbors. I became the wife he left for the younger woman. I wanted to disappear. For weeks, I cried until I had nothing left. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My whole life had been built around a man who replaced me like I was nothing. But somewhere between those sleepless nights and empty mornings, a small voice inside me whispered that this wasn't the end. That maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. I didn't know it then, but fate had its own plans. The kind of plans that would turn my heartbreak into something far more unexpected. Something that would make even Ethan wish he had never walked away. One Friday afternoon, I decided to surprise Ethan at work. I'd baked his favorite lemon muffins and thought maybe we could grab lunch together. Part of me hoped it would help fix whatever had been drifting between us. I remember parking outside his office, smiling nervously as I walked toward the building, clutching the small box of muffins like it was some kind of peace offering. But before I could reach the door, I saw him. He was standing in the parking lot laughing, not with a coworker, not with a client, but with her. Brooke Miller. She was everything I wasn't anymore. Young, carefree, glowing in the sunlight. And then, right in front of me, Ethan reached out and held her hand. Not the kind of innocent touch people share at work. It was tender, familiar. The way he used to hold mine. My body froze. I felt my chest tighten and my hands go weak. The box of muffins slipped from my fingers, hitting the ground. They didn't even notice. He leaned in and kissed her lightly on the cheek, whispering something that made her giggle. I turned and walked back to my car as quietly as I could, tears blurring my vision. I sat there for a long time, watching them from behind the wheel, my whole world collapsing in silence. Every year we'd spent together, every promise, every late-night talk, it all felt like a lie. I finally drove away, heart pounding, trying to understand how the man who once swore he'd never hurt me could do this so easily. By the next day, the whole office seemed to know. One of Ethan's co-workers, who had always been kind to me, called to say she was sorry for what happened. She told me Brooke had been bragging, saying Ethan was finally upgrading. She mocked my age, said I was too old to keep up. Hearing that broke me in a way I can't explain. I'd always carried myself with dignity, but now I felt like a joke everyone was laughing at. That night, I packed a suitcase and left the house. I didn't tell Ethan where I was going. I just left a note that said, "You made your choice. I'm done fighting for someone who doesn't want to be here." When I finally told him I was filing for divorce, he didn't argue. He didn't beg or apologize. He just shrugged and said Brooke made him feel alive again. That was it. 17 years of marriage ended with a sentence that felt rehearsed. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting on the edge of the bed in my small rented apartment. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I'd lost everything, my husband, my home, my pride, but I still had one thing left, myself. And no matter how broken I felt, I promised I wouldn't let Ethan or Brooke destroy what was left of me. After the divorce, I rented a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't big or fancy, but it felt peaceful, a place where I could breathe again. The first few weeks were hard. The silence was heavy, and I'd sometimes catch myself setting 2 plates at dinner before remembering I was alone. But little by little, the quiet started to feel like comfort instead of loneliness. I began focusing on myself for the first time in years. Every morning, I took long walks through the neighborhood just to clear my mind. I joined a local book club, started painting again, something I hadn't done since college, and even began therapy. At first, therapy felt uncomfortable. I didn't like talking about my pain out loud. But over time, it helped me see things differently. My therapist reminded me that healing wasn't about pretending to be fine, but about learning to live again without guilt or bitterness. I started saying yes to things I'd always put off. Dinner invites, weekend trips, volunteering at local events. One evening, I signed up to help at a community fundraiser for the town's youth center. It was just a small event, food stalls, live music, friendly faces. I spent most of the night arranging raffle tickets and serving food, enjoying the feeling of being useful again. That was when I met Richard Miller. He was standing near the donation table, holding a cup of coffee and chatting with one of the organizers. He was in his early 60s, tall, silver-haired, and had the kind of calm presence that instantly put people at ease. When our eyes met, he smiled warmly and said, "You've been running around all night. Let me get you a drink before you pass out." I laughed for the first time in a long while. We ended up sitting together for nearly an hour, talking about everything: the event, travel, books, even cooking. He told me he'd lost his wife 5 years ago and had thrown himself into charity work to stay busy. There was something so genuine about him. No arrogance, no judgment, just quiet kindness. When the night ended, he offered to walk me to my car. It wasn't romantic, just thoughtful. Before I left, he said, "You have a gentle strength about you, Caroline. Don't lose that." Those words stayed with me long after I drove home. In the weeks that followed, we ran into each other a few more times. At the grocery store, at another community event, even at the park one morning. Each time, he'd greet me with that same warm smile. Slowly, I began to realize that life was giving me a second chance. I didn't know where it was leading, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful again. Richard and I started seeing more of each other after that night at the fundraiser. At first, it was just friendly. He'd call to ask if I wanted to join him for coffee after the Saturday market or walk around the lake on Sunday mornings. I didn't think much of it, but those little moments became the highlight of my week. He had an easy way of talking, calm, sincere, never rushing me to open up, but always listening when I did. Our first official dinner happened by accident. We both volunteered again at another community event, and when it ended late, he suggested grabbing dinner since we were both starving. We went to a small Italian place downtown. Over pasta and wine, we talked for hours. He asked about my favorite books, my job, and what I wanted to do next in life. He didn't ask about my past, and I was grateful for that. For once, I wasn't being looked at as the woman whose husband left her. I was just Caroline, someone interesting, someone worth listening to. After that night, we kept meeting. Sometimes we'd sit by the lake with coffee. Sometimes we'd go for evening walks and talk about everything from childhood memories to silly daily things. Richard was gentle but confident, the kind of man who didn't need to impress anyone. He opened doors for me, paid attention when I spoke, and made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years. I felt safe with him. I felt seen. He told me he admired how I'd rebuilt my life after hardship, that not many people could do that with such grace. His words caught me off guard because no one had ever acknowledged how hard it had been. Everyone else had either pitied me or avoided the topic altogether. But Richard saw strength where others saw failure. And slowly, I started believing it too. By the time we had our third date, I realized I was genuinely happy again. We met at a cozy cafe on a rainy afternoon. We sat by the window, talking and laughing as thunder rolled outside. I remember him pulling out a small photo from his wallet to show me his family, his late wife and his daughter. He smiled softly as he spoke about them, saying his daughter lived nearby and worked in fitness. When I glanced at the picture, my heart stopped. It was her, Brooke. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My ex-husband's mistress, the woman who had wrecked my marriage, was his daughter. I stared at the picture, trying not to show how shaken I was. Richard had no idea. He spoke kindly of her, clearly unaware of the storm building inside me. I smiled weakly and excused myself to the restroom, gripping the sink and staring at my reflection in disbelief. Fate, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. When I left that cafe, my hands were shaking. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, staring out the windshield while the rain poured down. My heart felt like it was breaking all over again. Of all the men in the world, why did it have to be her father? The same girl who destroyed my marriage now unknowingly connected me to her family. The thought made my stomach twist. For the next few days, I avoided Richard. I ignored his calls and texts, pretending I was busy. I couldn't even find the right words to explain what had happened. I didn't blame him. He hadn't done anything wrong. But I felt trapped in a cruel joke life was playing on me. I thought about ending things quietly before either of us got hurt. But Richard was persistent, not in a pushy way, just gently concerned. One evening, he showed up at my door holding a small bouquet of flowers. "Caroline," he said softly, "if I've done something wrong, please tell me. I don't want to lose a friend without understanding why." His voice was full of kindness, and that broke down my walls. I invited him in, and we sat on the couch in silence for a while before I finally told him everything. My voice trembled as I explained who Brooke was, the affair, the divorce, the humiliation, everything. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even angry. I thought he'd walk out and never look back. But instead, he just sat there quietly listening. When I finished, he sighed and leaned back. "Well," he said after a moment, "that's a lot to take in." He rubbed his chin, thinking, then looked at me with the same calm expression he always had. "But I don't believe this is an accident. Maybe fate brought us together for a reason. Maybe to heal what they broke." His words stunned me. I felt tears burn in my eyes again, but this time, they weren't from pain. There was no bitterness in his tone, no judgment, just understanding. For the first time, I didn't feel like my past made me damaged. I felt like maybe it had led me somewhere I was meant to be. We talked for hours that night. He admitted he didn't have a perfect relationship with Brooke. They'd grown distant after his wife passed. Still, he said he would handle it carefully when the time came. I offered to step away, not wanting to make things harder for him, but he shook his head. "You've already been through enough," he said. "Let's take this one step at a time." From that night on, we agreed to keep seeing each other quietly. No grand plans, no expectations, just two people who had both been hurt, trying to find peace again. It was strange how something that once felt like a cruel twist of fate began to feel like something healing instead. Months passed, and my bond with Richard only grew stronger. What started as quiet companionship turned into something deeper, something I hadn't felt in years. He made me laugh again, reminded me what it meant to be loved with patience and respect. We took weekend trips, cooked dinner together, and spent evenings talking by the fireplace. There was no rush, no pretending, just peace. For once, I wasn't living in the shadow of betrayal. I was living for myself. Then one evening, everything changed. We were at his home, watching the sunset from the porch, when Richard took my hand and said, "Caroline, I don't want to spend another day without you." I thought he was just being sweet until he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught as he opened it. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady and full of warmth. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My heart raced, not because I doubted him, but because I understood what this would mean. Saying yes wouldn't just make me his wife. It would make me Brooke's stepmother. The thought was almost too unreal to process. The same woman who mocked me, who stole my husband, would have to call me Mom. Life had a strange sense of humor. I hesitated, looking at the ring glistening in his hand. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" I asked softly. "You know what comes with me." He smiled and said, "I'm not marrying your past, Caroline. I'm marrying you." That was all I needed to hear. I nodded through tears, whispering, "Yes." He slipped the ring on my finger, and I felt something inside me settle, like the universe had finally balanced the scales. While we planned the wedding quietly, word started to spread in town. And with that came whispers about Ethan and Brooke. I tried not to care, but people loved to talk. I heard they were constantly fighting, mostly about money. After the divorce, Ethan's finances had taken a serious hit. He'd underestimated how much of our shared life had been built by both of us. Brooke, used to fancy vacations and expensive gifts, wasn't adjusting well to the reality of bills and responsibilities. Rumors reached me that she'd been complaining to her friends about Ethan being boring and broke. Some even said she was flirting with other men at her gym. As much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The same picture-perfect romance they flaunted had started to crumble, and I didn't need to lift a finger. When I looked at my engagement ring, I felt no guilt, just peace. My life had fallen apart in the cruelest way, but somehow it had rebuilt itself into something stronger. The idea of becoming Brooke's stepmother didn't scare me anymore. It felt like poetic justice, not out of revenge, but as a reminder that sometimes karma doesn't need your help. It just takes its time. When the wedding invitations went out, I knew it wouldn't take long for the news to reach Ethan and Brooke. Part of me expected drama, but even I wasn't ready for how fast it spread. Within 2 days, Richard's phone was blowing up with calls from his daughter. She didn't even try to hide her anger. Brooke showed up at her father's house unannounced, furious. I wasn't there at the time, but Richard told me everything later. She accused him of being manipulated, claiming I was using him for revenge. She said I was playing some sick game to get back at her and Ethan. Richard let her vent, then calmly said, "You broke that woman's marriage, Brooke. She has every reason to hate you, but she doesn't. She loves me, and I love her. That's all there is to it." Apparently, Brooke didn't take it well. She shouted, cried, and slammed the door when she left. Later, Ethan called too, trying to sound composed but clearly panicking. He told Richard that marrying me would tear their family apart. Richard simply replied, "You did that yourself when you betrayed your wife." After that, neither of them reached out again. I thought maybe they wouldn't come to the wedding, and honestly, I hoped they wouldn't. But a part of Richard still wanted his daughter there, so an invitation was sent anyway. On the wedding day, I arrived early, feeling a mix of nerves and calm. The ceremony was being held at a small vineyard just outside town, surrounded by golden fields and sunlight. I wore a simple ivory dress, nothing extravagant, but it made me feel beautiful again. When guests began to arrive, I saw Brooke step out of her car in a tight dress and dark sunglasses, her expression unreadable. Ethan was with her, looking uncomfortable and pale. The moment our eyes met, he quickly looked away. It was surreal, seeing them both standing there, the man who betrayed me and the woman who replaced me, now watching me start over with someone who truly valued me. Throughout the ceremony, Brooke refused to smile. She sat stiffly, arms crossed, glaring every time Richard and I looked happy. Ethan kept his head down, shifting awkwardly in his seat. But none of it mattered. When Richard took my hands and said his vows, everything else disappeared. His voice was steady and full of emotion when he said, "You've taught me that love can begin again, even after pain." When I said I do, a wave of peace washed over me. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about freedom. The applause that followed felt like the closing of one painful chapter and the start of something beautiful. As we walked down the aisle as husband and wife, I caught Brooke's expression one last time. Disbelief, anger, maybe even regret. That day, I didn't need to prove anything. I had already won, simply by standing there, smiling beside a man who chose me for all the right reasons. After the wedding, Richard and I settled into his beautiful home by the lake. The view was breathtaking, calm water that shimmered in the mornings, soft sunsets that painted the sky in gold every evening. It was the same house Brooke used to brag about, the one she had once assumed would be hers one day. Life had a strange way of working things out. Now, it was my home, and she had to accept that. Moving in felt like starting fresh. The house had warmth to it, full of memories of Richard's past, but ready for new ones too. We spent mornings drinking coffee on the porch, talking about travel plans and small renovations we wanted to make. I felt at peace in a way I hadn't in years. Every corner of that house reminded me how far I'd come from the woman who once cried herself to sleep in a rented apartment. Brooke didn't take our marriage well. At first, she refused to speak to her father. Weeks turned into months of silence. Eventually, she sent a short text to Richard saying she would accept his choice, but made no effort to visit. Richard tried to stay patient, but I could tell it hurt him. He loved his daughter deeply, yet he also refused to be manipulated by her guilt. Whenever she did call, their conversations were cold and distant. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I never wanted to come between them, but Brooke made it clear she couldn't stand the idea of calling me stepmom. I never asked her to, of course, but the title existed whether she used it or not. The irony was hard to ignore. She had once mocked me, called me old and irrelevant, and now I was the woman married to her father. While she struggled to accept reality, Ethan's life started falling apart too. His company, the one he was so proud of, went under. Bad investments, poor decisions, and the loss of key clients had drained his savings. One afternoon, out of nowhere, I received a message from him. He wanted to meet to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He looked worn out when I saw him, thinner, tired, and full of regret. After a few awkward minutes, he finally admitted he was struggling financially. He asked if I could lend him some money, just until things stabilized. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh. I told him kindly but firmly, "Ethan, I don't deal with poor decisions or poor men anymore." His face fell. He tried to play the sympathy card, but I wasn't the same woman he once left behind. I wished him well and walked away. As months passed, Richard and I grew even closer. We took trips, hosted small dinners, and built a peaceful life together. He treated me with love and respect every single day. Meanwhile, Brooke and Ethan's perfect little world had crumbled. For once, I didn't feel anger or pride. Just quiet satisfaction knowing that life had simply balanced itself without me lifting a finger. A few months after things had finally settled, I ran into Brooke unexpectedly. It happened one evening when Richard and I went out for dinner at a new restaurant downtown. It was a quiet place, elegant but simple, the kind of spot where we could talk and laugh without anyone bothering us. After we finished eating, Richard went to get the car, and I waited near the entrance. That's when I saw her. Brooke was sitting alone at a small table in the corner. For a second, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thinner, tired, and nothing like the confident young woman who once carried herself with so much pride. Her hair was messy, her makeup barely done, and her eyes looked hollow. There was no trace of that smug smile she used to wear whenever she spoke about Ethan. She noticed me almost immediately. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and she froze. She looked embarrassed, almost as if she wanted to disappear. Slowly, she stood up and walked over to me. Her steps were hesitant, her confidence gone. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost shaking. "You really won, didn't you?" she said quietly. I looked at her for a moment, taking in how much had changed. I could have said 100 things. I could have reminded her how she mocked me, how she laughed when my marriage fell apart, how she flaunted what she thought was happiness. But I didn't feel angry anymore. The pain she caused me no longer had power over me. I simply smiled and said, "No, Brooke. I just stopped losing." She didn't respond. She looked down, nodded slightly, and walked away. I watched as she left the restaurant, her shoulders slumped, her confidence gone. For the first time, I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, just calm. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace, the kind that comes when you finally let go of bitterness. Later, when Richard came back with the car, he asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said, "Yes, it's better than okay." I didn't tell him who I'd seen. I didn't need to. The moment had already given me all the closure I needed. Driving home, I looked out the window and realized how far I'd come. I'd gone from being the woman left behind to the woman who rebuilt her life from nothing. Brooke had taken everything from me once, my marriage, my pride, my confidence. But in trying to destroy me, she'd given me something even more valuable, the strength to start again. That night, as Richard and I sat by the lake, I felt nothing but gratitude. I wasn't the same woman who once cried over Ethan's betrayal. I was stronger, wiser, and finally free. The sweetest justice wasn't watching Brooke fall. It was knowing I'd risen without needing her to. A year later, life felt completely different for Caroline. The woman who once cried herself to sleep was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, calmer, and genuinely happy. When she and Richard celebrated their first wedding anniversary, their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of peace she hadn't known in years. Friends surrounded them, toasting to love that came not from drama or youth, but from understanding and care. As she looked around that evening, Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, gratitude. She was thankful not just for Richard, but for the journey that led her to him. Every heartbreak, every tear, every lonely night had guided her here. Life had come full circle, and in that circle she found healing. After dinner, they stepped outside to the patio. The lake shimmered under the soft glow of the moon, just as calm as her heart now felt. Richard held her hand, and for a while, they didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words. It was peace. Caroline thought about Ethan and Brooke for the first time in months, but only briefly. They were no longer part of her story. From what she heard, Ethan had left town after his business failed, and Brooke had moved on, trying to start fresh somewhere else. But none of that mattered to her anymore. They were simply names from an old chapter, a chapter she no longer cared to reread. For Caroline, happiness wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It wasn't about revenge or seeing others fail. It was about living well, smiling again, and waking up every morning with no regrets. She had learned that the best kind of justice isn't loud or cruel. It's quiet, steady, and full of joy. Richard squeezed her hand gently and said, "You know, I think we were meant to find each other." Caroline smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Maybe we were," she whispered. "Maybe this was the universe's way of setting things right." They watched the water ripple, the night breeze brushing softly against their faces. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it all in, the peace, the love, the sense of closure. She had finally made it through the storm. Life had not turned out the way she once imagined, but in many ways, it turned out better. She didn't have to chase justice. It came to her naturally, in the form of happiness, kindness, and a love that restored her faith in herself. As the night grew quiet, Caroline smiled to herself. She wasn't the woman who lost anymore. She was the woman who healed, who learned, and who finally triumphed, not by fighting back, but by simply moving forward. And as she stood there hand in hand with Richard, she knew that this peace, this love, was the universe's way of saying, "You made it."